Hello everybody and welcome to part 22 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. We pick up exactly where we left off with our Kerbals just hanging out in a crater on Moho. We kind of ran out of time last episode, so we need to finish this outing off and then, if the fuel situation allows, conduct another one. So let's get this ball rolling. We already have a full set of reports and a surface sample, but we're going to need duplicates of all of those. In fact, we're going to need duplicates of all of our science experiments because, as I was saying last episode, we want to take 2 sets of science back to Kerbin. One to be processed with the space station's science lab, and one to take back down to the KSC. A slight exception to this is the mystery goo container and to a lesser extent the negative gravioli detector, because you don't quite get the full whack of science just by bringing one experiment back down to Kerbin. Ideally you'd like to bring 2, so I had planned to take 3 of those each, but in the end I forgot to do the 3rd gravity reading, so not ideal, but it won't do much harm in the long run. Bob Kerman is in charge of shuffling the science about, resetting experiments, taking duplicate reports. I'm trying to leave as much as is possible for us to do in orbit because it's going to be a lot easier to get this sorted there, but we do have to do a little bit of fiddling about down here on the surface, and Bob Kerman does a bang-up job of it. With his tasks completed then, Bob Kerman rejoins his colleagues aboard the lander, and then it is time for us to depart the surface and head back towards our mothership, the Galileo, currently sat in orbit where Valentina has been very patiently twiddling her thumbs for a little while now. Now, Moho is normally considered a reasonably tricky place to do a return journey to the surface. It's got a roughly similar gravity to Juno, but of course without the atmosphere, so you don't have anything to help you slow down during your descent. On the way up though, this definitely works to your advantage. For Juno, the general rule is you need about 1500 meters per second of delta V to get you back into a good orbit and dock with any potential mother craft, but with Moho we've managed it with a little over 1000 meters per second of delta V, and it doesn't take us much more than that to get ourselves back to our rendezvous with the Galileo. Having docked, we begin the process of transferring the science we've accrued over to the Galileo. It's pretty easy for the most part, but we do need to call upon the services of Bob Kerman once again, just to reset the remaining experiments and transfer the last of that data to its respective destinations. Having checked the delta V situation and after a little bit of maths, I decide we are going to proceed with a second mission down to the surface. After the lander gets back, we should have enough delta V to raise our orbit to a decent parking altitude, perform our transfer back to Kerbin, and have about 1000 meters per second of delta V as a safety margin. So we get the lander refueled and ready for action once again. With everything primed and ready to go, Jebediah switches places with Valentina, who'll be commanding this second trip down, and I'm sure she's delighted that she does actually get the opportunity to set foot on Moho, because it was kinda hanging in the balance for a while. So we get ourselves detached, we get ourselves underway, and yeah, the choice of landing site was a tricky one this time around. Last time we landed in what I thought would be the minor craters biome, but it wasn't. It was just a crater-like region which contained a mixture of highlands and midlands biomes. So my original plan was to try and aim for the same region, try and land at somewhere a bit different, and if we picked up the highlands biome again, it shouldn't be much fuel to make a short hop over to the midlands. But as we're travelling round, I notice a reasonably prominent minor craters biome on the day side of Moho, so I decide for this second outing we'll try and aim for that. I use a manoeuvre node just to make sure I've lined up the deorbit burn perfectly, and then we begin our descent, which goes pretty well. I start our final approach burn a little bit too late, and as we're coming down, we've just overshot the minor craters biome. We are coming down in the Midlands, which we haven't visited either, but by this point I'm pretty determined to visit those craters, so we start just a very short hop which does take us across into the craters biome. The landing isn't my finest work, but we do get ourselves safely down, ready to begin our very final round of science gathering. First things first though, Valentina needs to climb out and plant that flag, and after the dated reference from last episode, I decided to go even further with Some Like It Hot, a movie that was before even my parents' time. Bill and Bob come down to briefly join Valentina on the surface, but we do need to get down to business. So we start performing all of our experiments, ably assisted once again by Bob Kerman, and this time I do remember to take that 3rd negative gravioli detector reading. With Bob Kerman back aboard the lander and with all of our science done in duplicate and in some cases triplicate, we take off from the surface of Moho, bound once again for the Galileo, and I was keeping a nervous eye on our Delta V because I used, well, let's say more than I was expecting in that short correction hop just before we landed. There was no real need to worry, however. We do make it back to the Galileo with more than 200 metres per second of Delta V left, and once we're docked we can begin the process of transferring the very last of our Moho science across to its appropriate containers. With a little assistance from Bob Kerman, that all goes very smoothly. We do still have some fuel left, both in the lander's tanks and in the lander's refuelling tank, so we transfer all the liquid fuel across from those into the Galileo's main tank. We transfer all the spare oxidizer into the lander's tank and then jettison it from there, and with that, the Moho leg of our mission is complete, and it's time to start planning for our journey back to Kerbin. Our transfer window is nearly 70 days away, so for now we're just going to raise ourselves into a decent parking orbit. And we'll begin by using my normal trick of using some of the spare monopropellant to raise our orbit a little bit before the main burn. This first manoeuvre is just going to raise our orbit up to an altitude of about 150 kilometres. I like to do these monopropellant manoeuvres because it improves the Delta V. First of all, it's using propellant that wouldn't otherwise be used, stretching it out that way, but also it's making the craft a little bit lighter for all the future manoeuvres, so improving it further still. With that manoeuvre completed, we fire up our main engines to raise our orbit some more. This time we're going for 1,000 kilometres or thereabouts, which is a pretty decent parking orbit from which we can perform our transfer burn back to Kerbin. The Galileo is now a lot lighter than it was when we first set off from Kerbin. Those three liquid core nuclear engines now able to provide a decent amount of acceleration, so hopefully our burn back to Kerbin won't be quite as torturously long as its counterpart that took us out to Moho in the first place. With that manoeuvre done and dusted, we are ready and waiting for our transfer window to open, which, as I said, will be in a little under 70 days. Now, at this point, I had planned to switch back to Kerbin and begin construction of our new interplanetary vehicle, the one that will take a landing mission to Eve and, who knows, in future series, maybe even further afield. Yeah, that was the plan, but a little something came along to disrupt that. When I say a little something, I mean one of the biggest things we've currently got in the game. It's our other interplanetary craft, the Ptolemy. For some reason, in the back of my head, I thought this craft was about 80 days away from Kerbin. Turns out, not so much. It's about 7 days away from Kerbin, which throws my plans into a little bit of disarray, but there you go. As things currently stand, the Ptolemy will end up going the wrong way round Kerbin, so we need to perform a correction manoeuvre as soon as possible. As I said, I had planned to start work on our new interplanetary vehicle, but we wouldn't have been able to get very far before this thing arrived back anyway, so I thought, let's just get this thing home, get it sorted, get it refueled, refitted, ready for action again, and we'll go from there. Anyway, with our approach to Kerbin looking a little rosier, we follow the Ptolemy into its encounter, and now it's time to start thinking about our orbital insertion burn. We're going to go for an altitude of about 1,000 kilometres, which is pretty much what we're coming in at, and well, the planning goes alright, but the implementation is a little bit more problematic. As we're coming in, the burn time indicator is about as much use as an ashtray on a motorbike, and I have no idea when to start burning. I start doing some maths in my head. It's about 2 minutes to go until the node, and I realise that I probably should have started burning 3 minutes ago. So we fire up the engines nonetheless, and we have to do the circularisation in 2 passes. But we do end up with a nice orbit at about 900 kilometres. From here we can start planning our rendezvous with the Socrates space station, and we've got a fair amount to do once we get there. Of course, we've got to get the crew back down to Kerbin, we've got to get the science that's going down to Kerbin, and we've got to get this thing refueled, we've got to get the engines upgraded, similar to how we upgraded the Galileo. The Ptolemy's next mission will be to Dres, which it could probably do with its current engines, but more Delta V is never a bad thing. It means you get a lot more wiggle room in your transfer windows, which could prove very convenient for us. Having arrived at the Socrates, we bring ourselves into dock. We're using the same docking arm that the Galileo was using whilst it was here. And Once we're secured, it's time for us to get on with a few bits and pieces we need to do before we start thinking about anything else. We get the repeat experiments we've done transferred over to the space station's experiment storage containers. We could also sort out the lab whilst we're up here. It's running a little low on science, so we have a little browse through the available experiments and chuck them into the science lab so that that's running at full efficiency. And we've done pretty much everything we can whilst we're here in space, so it's time to switch our focus back to Kerbin and back to the Kerbals who are currently sat comfortably in the KSC and who haven't had a lot to do recently, to be fair, but now is the time for them to leap into action. So we find ourselves on the runway with our spaceplane. Corkin Kerman is the pilot in charge for this one, whilst our science officer Grados will be overseeing the safe return of all those experiments back down to the KSC. I haven't performed any upgrades to this craft since the last time we saw it. It pretty much does the job we need it to do right now, so I'm a little reluctant to tinker with it too much, but eventually we will need to perform some upgrades, especially if we want to have it taking any significant payload up into space, because at the moment it's not quite up to that task. One thing I have been tinkering with recently is the ascent procedure for this craft, trying to squeeze as much out of it as I possibly can. On this run, we make it into orbit with a little over 2,300 meters per second to spare. And that's with no payload. Well, effectively no payload. There's an experiment storage container in the cargo bay, but that's it. So a little bit of tinkering needed. If we can get a light payload into orbit with that same delta V, I think we'll be there, but we're not quite there yet. So this mission, as I mentioned, is to bring the science, not just the science, but also the crew from the Ptolemy back down to Kerbin. It should be a nice chunk of science, allow us to unlock some new parts for our a new interplanetary vehicle, and also I'm going to try and get the upgrades for those liquid core nuclear engines. I'm not sure if that only applies to new engines or if that spontaneously upgrades all the engines currently in the save. We'll have to see, but it should be a very useful bunch of new tech. Arriving at the Socrates, I say arriving at the Socrates, we shoot straight past it first time and have to go in for a second attempt. I did leave some lead-in time for those nuclear engines, but obviously not enough. But anyway, eventually we do get ourselves docked, and it is time for us to start transferring everything across to our spaceplane. I do toy with the idea of leaving some of the spaceplane's spare fuel up here just to start the refueling process of the Ptolemy, but it's not going to be much, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have to fire up those jet engines again on the way back down, so we leave it where it is for the time being. So with our payload of science transferred across, and with Kerdar, Donfort, Bargel and Johnny Kerman aboard the spaceplane, it's time for us to undock from the Socrates and start making our way home. In the end, we do get a very good descent. We don't need to touch any of the fuel aboard. We could have left some of it up there, in fact, but then again, that would have altered the flight characteristics of the plane, which would probably have meant we'd have had to fire up the engines and so on and so forth. It's just one of those things, really. Corkin Kerman's excellent piloting skills see us to a gentle landing on the runway and to the safe delivery of a little over 6,000 points worth of science, which we will spend in due course. We're nearly done for today then, but if the Ptolemy needs sorting out, then we really should get cracking with that. To that end, we are blasting off from the KSC with one of our Brunel Mark II rockets. Greyfried, Erison and Grados are along for the ride this time, and their mission is just to kick off the whole process of getting the Ptolemy turned around and ready for its next mission. Underneath that fairing, we have one of the large 36-ton fuel tanks full of liquid fuel, which we're going to use to fill up one of the Ptolemy's main tanks, begin the process of refueling it. Thanks to the Brunel Mark II, we shouldn't need to do that many lifts, should only be about 3, but of course we will need to do the engine upgrade before we do that final lift and fill all of its tanks all the way up. Our new interplanetary craft will have to be put on hold just for the moment, with what's happening to the frame rate with just one of the interplanetary craft docked. Ideally, I'd like to wait until there's a window where no interplanetary craft are docked before we start building it. I think that's gonna be a necessity almost. Now, as I've mentioned, once the Ptolemy is refitted, refueled, and of course once its transfer window opens up, it will be off to Dres, which I think happens in a little over 100 days' time, which means we should have a period of about 150 days between that and the Galileo returning to the Socrates. So I've sort of earmarked that as the period when we will actually get on with building this new interplanetary craft, but Yeah, I'm not entirely happy about the wait. I'd prefer to get the whole thing underway now, but that's just the way things have worked out. Anyway, our crew arrives at the space station. We're on the night side of the planet as we begin our manoeuvres, but we do wait until we're in daylight to complete our docking procedure, and then we can start transferring that fuel across. Just before that, I transfer all the Ptolemy's remaining fuel to its forwardmost tank. It's very nearly enough to fill it, so I just top it up with some fuel from the Brunel CSM, and then we can use our cargo to fill the Ptolemy's second larger fuel tank. With that done, for one final time this episode, it's time for our Kerbals to undock from the space station and start making their way home. Remembering, of course, to ditch that now empty fuel tank to burn up in the atmosphere as we go. Once again, we're trying to land the command module close to the KSC. Once again, we don't have much luck, but at least our Kerbals do splash down safely in the oceans, and that will bring today's episode to an end. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. If you have, please consider liking, subscribing, following me on Twitter, link in the description. I will be back soon. We've got to finish servicing the Ptolemy and, of course, think about bringing the Galileo home. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.